But now we are going to talk about critical reading passages and the various strategies related to the critical reading passage-based questions. Okay, so College Board is really, really good at searching the world for the most boring passages. And if we think back to, grade school and try to remember the lecture that the teacher taught about osmosis, it's very unlikely that we will remember the details of that. But if we try to remember what happened last night on How I Met Your Mother or some other television show, it's more likely that we'll remember every single detail and maybe even be able to recite some lines. So it's easier to remember things that are interesting to us. And it's difficult to be interested in a lot of the passages that College Board writes, but if you can, this is a little bit more of a psychological strategy, if you can pump yourself up and try to create that interest, then that will help you a ton. If you can't, and most people can't, so don't feel bad, then you need to turn yourself into more of a detective as you're reading these passages. And you need to be very active in your reading. When I say active, that means underlining things, taking notes in the margins. We'll talk about a few other strategies that one can use to get more actively reading of these passages. And I find that if you can do that, then keeps your mind from wandering a little bit. You'll read it a bit faster and probably start to be able to identify where the questions are going to come in the passages. Remember, this SAT is more like a puzzle than it is an exam. So once you get good at kind of figuring it out, the puzzle, then you'll see a lot more performance increase. Okay, so in the reading passages, this is always a part that's a little difficult for me to explain, mainly because different students will use different strategies and different things work for different people. But a lot of students will ask me, well, how should I read should I read the questions first and then read the passage? Should I even read the passage, or should I just jump into the questions? And since the questions continually point me back to the passage, I'll be getting enough of the passage as I go through the questions. You're going to have to play around with a few things. Personally, I do believe that you should read the passage first, though it might be helpful to kind of skim the questions before you read the passage. That is, kind of go really quickly through the passages. Now, there are 4 different kinds of questions that typically come up in the passages, and I'm going to go through those in detail. So right now what I would say is when you're reading the questions, you're going to want, if you're going to read the questions before you read the passage, you're going to want to focus on those questions that relate to a specific area in the passage, like when they draw you back to, let's say, lines 5 through 7. Then that can be a good thing to just make a little mark in the margin to let you know that there is going to be a question related to lines 5 through 7, so that you read that a little more carefully when you're skimming through the passage. I would say that if you're going to just skim the passage as opposed to reading it carefully, and that may be a strategy that you want to use because some students do find time issues with getting through the critical reading section because of these long passages. But if you're going to skim, it's a very good idea to read the first paragraph very well and the last paragraph very well. Mainly because the point of the passage is usually going to come up in the first paragraph or the last paragraph. Other than that, as I mentioned before, it's very good to underline as you're reading. I know that we're taught not to write in our textbooks in the school, but your parents pay a lot of money for this test and nobody's going to use it after you, so go ahead and write all over the place. And again, it's a good way to stay more active while you're reading. If you want to know what you should be underlining, also underlining is a great strategy for preparing for college because you're going to have a lot more reading in college, and when you read, you'll underline important parts, and then when you're preparing for your test, you'll probably come back and just read your underlines instead of the whole thing. So good things to underline would be tough words, vocabulary words that you don't know, tough phrases. You might make some kind of highlight on the side in the margin where there might be a certain amount of lines that went by that you really just didn't feel like you got perfectly. The reason for that is that we're out of habit. We're really good at when we're reading anything, if a newspaper or a book or whatever, if there's something that we don't really understand, we typically just keep going, gliding over it, realizing that we're going to catch up to the main idea and understand where the author was going with that. But the College Board, being sneaky guys like they are, typically will put the questions in those areas. They do that because they know of our habit of spacing out a little bit and expecting to catch up. They'll also often put a question right after an area like that. If they know that you're probably not really paying attention, then you probably were lost even a couple lines after that difficult area. So underlining or highlighting that just kind of makes you aware that this was an area I had a bit of a difficult time with. Another strategy that I've had students do in the past, and it could be something that you just do in practice, but then kind of it becomes automatic that, and you don't have to necessarily do it in official tests where time is more of an issue, but underline or circle the transition words. Transition words would be words like, but. Well, let me go through a few of them for you. Transition words that might be in opposition would be words like although, however, in spite of, rather than, nevertheless, on the other hand, but. So any of those words are going to tell us that the author is going to be taking a different direction. It's going to be opposing the previous point of view that he was writing about, he or she was writing about. Words that relate to support would be like moreover, besides, additionally, furthermore, in fact. All of those words would be showing support of whatever he said or he or she said before. And then words that connect to results would be like therefore, consequently, accordingly, because, when, and so. And these are words that are indicating that we're moving into an area where we're going to talk about the result. So underlining or being aware of the transition words kind of maps the passage as you go through and read the passage, and will give you an idea of the direction that the author is going in. Again, really helps to just keep you active in your reading, and also can help when you're answering specific questions and look at the transition words and see if there's a clue there. Last thing I'd kind of talk about in terms of general strategies would be use the margins. In fact, I think certainly in practice, you might not have time in the official test, but in practice, you should be writing the main idea or the primary purpose of each paragraph. As you go through a paragraph, just take a moment to write in the margin and say, well, what's the primary purpose of that? Also, you might look at what is the mood, the tone of voice that the author is using in that paragraph. And that's a good segue to begin to talk about the 4 kinds of questions that come up in passage-based reading, because main idea and tone and mood are 2 of the kinds of questions that typically come up in the passage-based reading. I always like to talk about this in that it's kind of good news. You see all these questions in passage-based reading, and then you, to know that there's really only 4 kinds of questions that are going to come. Of course, there's combinations of these 4 kinds of questions, which makes more. But it's very, very helpful if you get good at identifying what kind of question the one that you're approaching at that moment is. So let me go over real quickly the 4 kinds of questions, and then we'll talk about strategies that one uses in each of these 4 kinds of questions. Okay, the first kind is tone and mood questions. We talked a little bit about that just before. This is the tone or the voice that the author uses, the mood that one gets from the passage. Then you have questions that I call them inference questions. Inference questions are questions that the facts are not actually given in the passage, but we have to infer from the facts to get the answer, or we look for the implied information from what's given in the passage. As one might guess, those are a bit trickier. You can identify those kinds of questions because they will usually have in the question itself, it'll say something like, the author most likely means, or in line 7, the author suggests that, or the author implies that. That would be a clear indication that this is an inference question. The third kind of question, I call it detecting details. Other people will call it function questions, or they might call it vocabulary and context. But these are the questions that draw you back to a particular place in the passage. Often they are vocabulary and context, or sometimes they're just asking about a particular area in the passage in that very specific spot. Okay, so those are detecting detail questions. And the fourth kind of question that we typically see in the passage-based reading would be main idea questions. Those are often called global questions or theme questions, and these are relating to the main idea of the whole passage. And you can see how that it might help to have the main idea of each paragraph, because you start to get a sense of what the overall passage is by looking at your notes in the margins for each of the paragraphs and what the primary purpose of each paragraph was. Right, so running back to the first strategy, the first type of question, which is the tone and mood questions. I like tone and mood questions. I think a lot of students have a hard time with them because it seems a bit like an inference. You know, they never say, I'm speaking in a confident tone or an informational mood. But the reason I like them is that they're pretty easy to identify that it's this kind of question. And they the answers will typically come from the adjectives used. Tone and mood questions may come as a global question, meaning the overall tone and mood of this passage was blah, blah, blah. But it also might come as a detecting detail. You know, so they might say the first paragraph, the tone is most like da da da. So I find if I strip out all of the other areas that they've asked for and really focus in on the adjectives, the descriptive words or the descriptive phrases that are being used in that area, then I can typically find patterns, and then I look for those groups of words that mean roughly the same thing to figure out what the closest mood of the 5 options. So here I do compare the 5 options. I get a general sense of what I think the tone or mood would be, and then I compare those 5 options. I should say, as a general strategy, if I haven't yet, that like the sentence completion questions, and really like every question in the SAT, you want to have your answer before you go to the 5 optional answers. Do not let them trick you by going into one of their traps and picking the tempting answer. Have your own idea and then compare with the 5 optional answers. Another way that these tone and mood questions might come across is something I call having a coffee question. Okay, so this is where they might ask you if they have 2 paired passages, say 2 short paired passages, and they might ask you, what would the author of passage 2 say to when the author of passage 1 says lines 2 through 4? Okay, and this is kind of an inference question too, because we don't really know. They didn't actually speak together, and the author of passage 2 didn't reply to that. So I like to picture the 2 people having a cup of coffee, and you want to use main idea, because you'll know the main idea of both authors. And you want to imagine that the 2 of them are sitting there, and their personality has to be likened to their main idea. So if one of them says the line blah, 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 whatever 2 through 4 was, then you try to find what would be the most likely line of the 5 options that the author of passage 2 would say that would fit to the author of passage 2's main idea. So you're going to see that in talking about these strategies, we use all the same things, inference and main idea and tone and mood, in order to answer the options. Okay, so that's enough really on tone and mood questions. As I said, with all of these, it's really more about practicing these things. A lot of this, the first time you hear it, would just be like, what is he talking about? But it will start to sink in as you analyze your wrong answers and start to see what I'm talking about. The second kind of question was the inference question. And as I mentioned, you'll often recognize these because they'll say the author most likely means blah, 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 or the author suggests such and such. So inference questions are pretty difficult because this is, it's not given in the passage. This is where we have to use our own common sense. And it's where I think students make the most mistakes and the most mistakes will come when they choose an answer that's really out of the scope of what is given in the passage. Or they might use their own common sense or knowledge to answer the question, but that would be out of scope because we need to use the author or the material that's been given in the passage to answer this. Another way to think about inference questions is it's the reasonable assumption that we might be able to use to come up with the answer. So you want to stay away from things that are a little too far away. And now this is going to get very esoteric, but it works for me. And I think if you try it in practice, it'll begin to work for you. I'm a very visual learner, so this works for me that way. I picture that the facts are like in a ball, and the facts are everything that's given in the passage. And the answer to the inference question is like a bubble around the ball. So when I read the 5 optional answers, I try to see, is that answer within the bubble? Okay, it's likely not going to be within the fact because I know that it's a inference question, so they won't give me the facts. Or if they do give me a fact, it might be a fact that's not part of that area, those lines that they asked me about. So is it part of the inference bubble, or is it outside the inference bubble? And that's the part that's a little hard it's something that you get only with practice. But what I mean by outside, is it out of the scope? Is it outside of the area that they're asking about in the passage? When you're dealing with inference questions, you want to focus a lot more on the why and not the what. So you want to understand, why is the author saying this? Or why is the author bringing up this point? Not what did the author bring up. A lot of times the out of scope will come in the what part. Again, this is only really going to make sense when you practice it. So for now, you remember that Prabh said, focus on the why, not the what. And when you're analyzing questions that you get wrong and you recognize that they're inference questions, I'd like you to think, did I focus on the what, not the why? And as with the other kinds of questions, you want to predict your own answer before you look at the options. Have your own idea of what it is. Even if you go through the 5 options and don't find something close to your own answer, then you can say, okay, maybe I'm off because it should have come up, something that I close to what I was looking for. And you can go back to the context of the passage and then come up with another prediction. Right. The next kind of question is detecting details. And students typically like detecting details because it tells you exactly where to look in the passage. Because of that, they do tend to be a little trickier. I mean, there'll be more traps that they use in the detecting details questions. So we'll go over some of those traps. Right. Just want to see if, yeah. Okay, so in the detecting details questions, we want to be careful that, number one, we're dealing with the area that they've asked about. Okay, so detecting details questions, you quickly ascertain that, all right, this is a detecting details question, and it asks for information between line 5 and 8. Now, that means that it's okay if we read from line 3 to line 10, to refresh our memory. And we may find the answer in lines 3 or 9. But we can't go too far out of that area because they're asking us right about that particular area. And one of the traps that they will typically use is to give us a right answer, meaning something else in the passage that's true, but it's not related to that particular area that they asked about. So we want to be careful about that trap answer. Another thing that they will typically do is that they will distort the answer, okay? And that means that part of the answer is yummy, that's exactly dead on and it's exactly what I was predicting. But then the latter part of the answer will make it incorrect. It might be even just one word. And so we get so excited about the beginning of the answer that we just ignore the latter part, and then that's what makes it wrong. So I like those because I look for the distorted part and I say, okay, well that ain't true, because I like the beginning of this, but that part isn't true. So now I know that is not it, and I know that that's a distorted answer trap. Another way that they'll kind of make the detecting details questions difficult is they'll ask about opposites, or they'll use words like everything, which of the below is true, all of the below is true except one, or they'll use the word opposite, what would be the opposite of what the author of passage 1 is talking about in lines 2 through 5. Straight away, if you see anything in capital in a question, and particularly in a detecting details question, you can assume that that's a difficult level question, and you want to be careful with those, and you may even want to circle it and come back to it if you have more time. But when you see those capital ones, be careful, read the question very carefully, because one of the optional answers, one of the wrong answers, will be answering it to not the opposite, so that if you didn't read it carefully, you'll pick that and you'll be very confident and you'll move on. And I've got a lot of students when I'm analyzing questions that will be like, oh, I didn't see that they meant opposite, So just be real careful with that. Another thing you want to be careful with, another trap that they use in detecting details, and something to keep in mind really in all the critical reading, is that the College Board is very, very wary of using extreme words or extreme phrases. They don't like to use things like always or never or everybody or no one, because it's too easy to argue an absolute like that. So this one always gets me in trouble because there's going to be a few questions that will be extremes, and it actually will come down to that. Or it could even be an extreme word, like the author of passage 1 disdains the author of passage 2, hates the author of passage 2. Very strong word. If the evidence is there in the passage to support an extreme word, then it might be an option. But more often than not, they like to avoid the extremes. So just be careful of the extremes. You'll find that they are often wrong. Last trap that you'll see in the detecting details is what I call the fake detecting details question. And that'll be when they're asking, they point you to a couple lines, and you immediately are like, okay, that's a detecting details question. But they're actually asking about something before or after those two lines. For example, they might ask in a question, the author describes the final experiment that he performed was in order to answer critics who argued that, okay? So in the lines that they point out to us, they do talk about how he's designing his final experiment, but they don't tell us what were the critics saying that forced him to do that. For that, we need to go a couple paragraphs before and skim around and find what did the critics say, so that we can find out what the answer is. So those are a little tricky, and there's not too many of those, but I thought I'd point those out. Okay, then we've got the main idea questions. Main idea questions are relating to the overall idea of the passage. As I said earlier, they will typically come up in the first or the last paragraph. So reading those carefully is always a good idea. And not unlike when we talk about the essay in the writing section, that's what you do. You're going to clearly indicate what you're going to talk about in the first paragraph. okay? Then in the body of the essay, you're going to describe what you're talking about, and you'll give the details, all the pertinent information. And in the last paragraph, you're going to talk about what you have talked about. You'll review everything. So often the first and last paragraph will give you a good idea of what the main idea of the passage is. Traps that you find in main idea questions is that one is the out of scope, the idea of out of scope. If it's out of scope of the passage, they might ask us a main idea and we go too far from that. I can think of a particular example, short passage, where they talk about a woman astronaut and they talk about her success and going into space and everything, and then they talk about how she's now championing women in science, you know. And so then they say, what is the main idea of this passage? And an out of bounds or an out of scope answer would be that she's very charismatic. Now, we might assume that she's charismatic because she's been so successful and now she's championing the cause of other people to do this work, but they don't bring that out. The real main idea is really just cataloging the successes that she's had on her road to fame. Okay, so out of scope is one of the main areas of main idea that they'll trap us and to get us to answer the tempting answer. Distortions, again, sometimes part of the answer will be right and there'll be one word or part of the answer that makes it incorrect. So you want to be careful of that. Again, you want to be careful of extremes here. Also in main idea, College Board tends to be very politically correct. They would never say something like, you know, all women authors are inferior to male authors. Even if the author of the passage had that perspective, they just don't want to put that in there because they don't want to get a bunch of angry letters from, you know, incredibly smart women who disagree with them. So they try to stay pretty politically correct, and their answers will usually be pretty politically correct. Then the other thing I would mention, just as a general strategy that you want to do when you're looking for the main idea, is as you're reading, you want to, you know, look for the main idea. As I said, you know, finding the primary purpose of each paragraph is a good way to do that. The intro and the conclusion are a good way to do that. Underlining certain elements of the passage that relate to what you have predicted is the main idea is a good way to confidently decide what the main idea is. Also in main idea questions, pay very close attention to the first word of the 5 optional answers. The first word will usually give a clue as to whether, like, if I thought that the main idea of that passage that I described earlier as an example was to catalog the successes that she's had, then a word like catalog or to list or to describe would be a likely first, sorry, my phone, would be a likely first option, a likely first word in an optional answer. Similarly, if it was a passage mostly about exploring or exploration, then you'll likely see that kind of word come up as the first word in the optional answers. Okay, we talked a lot about critical reading strategies. Don't worry if it just seems like it's on the surface level for you. In fact, it is on the surface level until you practice these, until you start connecting these to the wrong answers and trying them out again and starting to see these things in practice, and then it starts to make a lot more sense. Review this if you like. You know, I think maybe after you've done some practice with critical reading, come back and listen to this again. Some of these strategies will make more sense after you've been practicing them. But they're all very useful strategies. There's more we can talk about, but these are the general ones that I wanted to go over initially. And this has already been a pretty long session. So great. Well, we will move into the writing strategies after this, as well as the essay, which is part of the writing section. Thank you.